There's a new day dawning, the time is at hand, where the glory of the Lord will be revealed to every man. Open the door, open the door, open the door, and let the King of Glory in. Open the door.
Well, let the King of Glory in. Open up the door. Starts right now. So fling wide you heavenly gates. Prepare the way of the risen Lord. The Apostle John was on the island of Patmos. He was in prison for the testimony of Jesus Christ. And he heard a sound behind him. He said, behold, I looked. There was a door standing open in heaven. And I heard a voice which was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, come up here, and I will show you the things which must take place. That's what we need, my friends. We need a heavenly perspective of the things that are going on in the world around us, the things that the Word of God foretold us would come to pass, those things which must take place, those things which are taking place even now. That is what this broadcast is all about, discussing the issues of the day and discerning times in which we live from a biblical perspective and worldview. Good afternoon, everybody. What you are about to hear is the fusion of heart, mind, and soul. And I am Andy White, your host, and I am here penetrating the unseen powers of darkness by simply speaking the light of truth, sending powers and principalities into frothy fits of frenzy. Good afternoon, everybody from all across the fruited plain and all around the spherical globe. Thanks for tuning in. I am streaming live on my Facebook page over at Open Up the Doors. If you want to join in over there, please go on over to the Open Up the Doors Facebook page at facebook.com/faithfm91.7 and join in the conversation over there and let us know where you're watching from. And for all of you on Facebook, please share this into your streams and invite people to Open Up the Doors. If you've never liked the page, please like the Open Up the Doors page as well and join the friends, join the family, join the supporters here on Open Up the Doors. And listen, I am looking for as much of an interactive experience here on Open Up the Doors that I can. That means I need you. I need the audience to be actively engaged in conversation over there on Facebook Live, as well as just posting to the page, posting comments, posting things over on the Open Up the Doors page. And we will be, we're really engaged with the issues of the day, engaged in the things that we're dealing with as sojourners in this Christian journey. Hey, listen, Faith FM does stream live over the internet if you are outside of the Faith FM broadcast area here on the east end of Long Island. And you can stream us over at hamptonschristian.com, which is the home church of Faith FM. And we have the apps, the Faith FM apps, which are absolutely free. We have them for the Android. We have them for the Apple devices. You can find the links over there for the apps. So you can listen to Christian broadcasting from the east end of Long Island, wherever you are around the spherical globe, 24/7 by downloading that free app. All right, I think I got all of my preliminary things out of the way. One more thing. If you'd like to email me, you can email me at ajwhite777@icloud.com. That's ajwhite777@icloud.com. And I am going to embark now for the next several broadcasts. We're going to be talking about really one of the major issues of the day, an issue that I saw coming 10 years ago into a positioning. And 10 years ago, people saying, nah, it's not going to happen. You were called all kinds of crazy names when you mentioned it. And that issue is socialism, my friends, because it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue in the coming campaign, even bigger than it was 10 years ago when Barack Obama first ran for president back in, when was that, 2008 or so, whatever it was, and we started seeing the socialist leanings of the Obama administration. But, there's this new group of radicals that seem to want to suck up all the oxygen in the media, and the media is being willing sycophants that they are. They're allowing these new radicals to suck up all the oxygen in the media, and they like to call themselves a squad now. And I'm sure you know who I'm talking about. That's their newest what's the word I'm looking for? tagline, the Squad, as they're calling themselves, AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and their newest sidekick, who I'm not really that familiar with, but all of a sudden she's in the mix, Ayanna Presley. But along with the Squad here now, folks, and Crazy Bernie, who's really beginning to burn out a little bit because of all these up and coming new faces, but he was the forerunner of this crazy socialism idea that's coming to fruition in our country. But this Squad, I don't know if I want to call them the Mod Squad or the Crazy Squad, I don't know, but they're calling themselves the Squad. But them, along with Crazy Bernie and their media sycophants, folks, they are trying to push for a socialist revolution. Make no mistake about it, my friends. That's really what they're trying to do. And what was once radical and marginal is now being embraced. It's being embraced and is being celebrated by a large, increasingly larger, vocal part of the Democratic leadership. And I want to stress that. The Democratic leadership in D.C., the District of Corruption. But the good news is this. As much as the Democratic leadership is more and more being emboldened to embrace and even celebrate these ideas of socialism, the good news is this. There was a poll that came out the other day. And the polls show, and one thing about this, too, is that it was the Democrats that actually leaked these polls. There's a lot of political intrigue that's going on over there in D.C. But the Democrat Party, the Democratic leadership, they leaked a poll. And one of the things in the poll shows that a vast majority of Americans reject socialism. And even a majority in the Democratic Party, which I was amazed to hear. That's good news. Believe it or not, that's a good sign that even still the majority of Democrats reject socialism. And yet it's being pushed and it's being promulgated by the leadership and, of course, by the media. And that's why, nevertheless, we need to keep pushing back on the socialist narrative, because the millennials and their sycophants in the media, they keep pushing for it. And they're the ones that are making it seem like it's more popular than it really is. Now, it is popular, mind you, amongst the millennials, amongst the younger generation. It is popular amongst them, but that's because they don't even really understand what it is. And that's because they really lack the real-life experience of dealing with what socialism really is. And they've been indoctrinated by their liberal teachers and college professors. And they didn't live through the USSR days, as well as the communist revolution in China or Cuba. But even though they've missed all those aspects of socialist history, you would think they would do a double take, because we do have a real-time situation of what socialism has done by looking at Venezuela today. But these folks seem to they just want to conveniently ignore and dismiss what's going on in Venezuela as being merely the consequences of just another dictatorship, failing to understand, failing to recognize that socialism inevitably leads to dictatorships. And the younger generation simply doesn't know what socialism actually is. And that's a huge part of the problem. Because you know what? Socialism doesn't mean simply sharing or simply being generous. You see these guys like Jesse Waters and others who go out on the streets, the man on the street reports, and they ask these college kids what socialism is. And it's laughable when you hear their answers. Oh, it means to be, a society that's social together. We'd like to socialize together. I mean, those are real answers. They don't even know what it is. And it is actually laughable, except that it's serious, and they're voting for something and they're pushing for something that they don't even understand what it is. But socialism doesn't mean simply sharing with others or being simply generous or any other of the nonsensical euphemisms and utopian fairy tales that they like to fabricate. Again, they just don't understand the distinction between socialism and even the welfare state, because the countries they point to, for instance, like Norway and Sweden and some of these Baltic states, they point to them as being examples of success in socialism, but they're not socialist. They are not fully socialist states. They have a free market capitalist system. And that's why we need to keep pushing back and keep educating people as to what socialism actually is and the damage that it's actually brought to those countries that have tried to fully implement it. Not to mention the damage it brings to the human soul, my friends. And I'm going to cover these things over the course of the next several weeks. We're going to embark in a educational endeavor because this needs to be done. I taught on socialism on this broadcast the first year I was on, but that's like 5 years ago. And it's time to re-educate and bring it into remembrance, because the audience has grown, the audience has gotten bigger, and I want to really focus on these things for the next couple of weeks. And that's why I'm going to be talking about it for the next couple of weeks. Except unless something major happens in the news, and I need to really cover that. But even though, as I said a moment ago, that the polls show that socialism is still unpopular and most are opposed to it, never underestimate, my friends, the power of the propaganda media. Remember, even in Nazi Germany, not all Germans were Nazis. The Nazi Party was only 10% of the country. And look at the incredible damage that 10% did. When 10% is in control, when 10%'s got the propaganda machinery, when 10% has got the power, well, the 10% of the Nazis had the majority of power in their Reichstag, or whatever they call their parliament, Reichstag. But I digress a little bit. But my point is this. Don't underestimate, just because the polls are against it and just because a majority of Americans are against it, don't think for a second that they can't win, because the propaganda and the emotional appeals are very real. And as I said a moment ago, we have this new generation of quote unquote future leaders who are sadly represented by folks like the AOC squad. And I'm going to take my time going through these issues. I really am. Because there's a lot to cover and a lot of things that are dovetailing together and being interwoven. But one more thing that I do want to mention before I get into the nitty-gritty of addressing the cancer that is socialism. The cancer. Make no mistake about it, my friends. Socialism is a cancer. There's one more thing of particular concern to me as a Bible teacher and as a minister of the gospel, and it's this. To see the growing belief amongst professing Christians that socialism is taught in the Bible. It most definitely is not. And I'm hearing some of these progressive Christians claiming that Jesus was a socialist. He most definitely was not and is not. And again, I'm going to be covering these things. I'm just not going to be rhetorical. I'm going to back it up with the Word of God and with sound theology, sound doctrine, and sound philosophy. But I have something to say to these progressive, quote-unquote, progressive Christians and the so-called social justice warriors and leftists who twist the Bible in order to conform it to their ideology. Those of you who misapply biblical precepts and principles and turn them into meaning something other than what they actually mean. I got something to say to you folks, and here it is. Ready? Read my lips. The Bible is not socialist. Selah. The Bible is not socialist, and it does not teach socialist ideology whatsoever. And as a matter of fact, it is inherently and philosophically capitalistic. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I just heard all the heads exploding of the leftists and the liberals. I just heard their heads exploding. Yes, folks, we're going to look at this because fundamentally, intrinsically, by the laws of nature and of nature's God, the Bible is actually inherently capitalistic. But we'll get to that point. But let me begin to lay down some foundations. And I want to begin with this. One of the new tactics, if you will, that these new wave socialists and progressive Christians have been trying to pull off on us the last few years is that they are trying to tell us that, quote, socialism really doesn't have a textbook dictionary definition, end quote. And the reason I have that in quotes is because I had a democratic socialist friend tell me that once. And I see it all the time. In fact, I read an article just the other day, an article I will be referencing and deconstructing and disassembling over the course of the next several weeks. It was actually printed in the online blog Pathos, which is really a kind of a progressive, mostly progressive religious site, progressive Christian site. Pathos has a lot of guys on there that I deem as being heretics. They're liberal. But back in March, this guy wrote an article titled Jesus Was Socialist. And the other day, I really read through this article in depth. And I'm going to be, like I said, over the course of several weeks, I'm going to disassemble this because the article was just flat out terrible exegesis. It was eisegesis. It was again reading into scriptures what your predispositional assumptions were. But I said all this because I mentioned a moment ago that these people are trying to tell us that socialism really doesn't have any textbook dictionary definition. And as an example, from this article I just read the other day, let me quote from the author of this article. Jesus was a socialist. The author states this, quote, socialism has always been a broad concept covering multiple variations and many different aspects. In other words, you really can't define it. But this next line, this is key. This is in the article. This is a direct quote. And I have little interest in debating what constitutes true socialism. Therein lies the problem, my friends. He doesn't want to debate what constitutes true socialism. Because if he did, he would be forced to admit that his thesis is wrong, that his exegesis is wrong. So we'll hide behind this idea that you really can't define true socialism. It's too big, it's too wide. Wow, how convenient is that? To say that you really can't define socialism or hold to a textbook definition of it. How convenient. Sorry, folks. I'm sorry. That's not how this works. Words mean things, folks. And if you want to use words like socialism or even stick the word democratic in front of it, if you want, then you've got to deal with what the word means. And not say something like, I have little interest in debating what constitutes true socialism. Of course you have little interest in debating what constitutes true socialism, because you'd lose the argument. Wow. But like I said, if you want to use words like socialism or democratic socialism, well, then you've got to accept how it's defined and what it means. Because words mean things. You're not free to say that it has no definition. Because if a word or a term has no definition, then it can mean anything that you want it to mean. And that's not how this works. I'm telling you, I had a democratic socialist friend of mine a few years back tell me this. Now, hold on to your seats, because when I heard this, I did a double take. I was like, what? This brother actually said this. I'm not making it up. This is a quote. Dictionaries. Well, let me back up, because I was sharing with him the dictionary textbook definition of socialism, which I will with you in a moment as well. But I'm building up to that point. When I shared with him the textbook definition of socialism, here's what his response to me was. Dictionaries don't define words. Yeah, let that sink in. I told you a moment ago, if words mean things, and if words don't mean what they mean, then you can make them mean anything that you want them to mean. And he told me flat out, dictionaries don't define words. He said they just tell you how they were used at a current moment that the dictionary was written. Now, it was one of the most absurd statements I think I've ever heard in my life, that dictionaries don't define words. Really? Really? I mean, if you're reading something, which I do, I read a lot, and if I'm reading something and I come across a word that I never saw that word before, I don't think I know what that word means. I immediately look it up. And I'll tell you now with the internet, man, they made it really easy. All you got to do is highlight the word and tap on dictionary. Well, why would I do that? Because dictionaries define words. That's why. Like, what? I'm sorry. It's just some of these arguments become so absurd. Words mean things. If you're reading something you don't know what it word means, what it says, what are you going to do? You're going to go to a dictionary to find out what the word means. And I said all that to say this. Because when I talk about socialism, I'm going to talk about the textbook dictionary meaning of the word, and not some ambiguous euphemism that they would like the word to mean in their own fantasy world. A fantasy world where words don't mean what they actually mean. And you can make them mean anything that you want them to mean. See, I don't live in that world. In fact, none of us live in that world. Well, maybe some people really do live in their fantasy world, but that's another topic altogether. But I don't live in that world where words don't mean things and where you can just redefine things. See, that's what they've been trying to do all along. They want to redefine marriage. They want to redefine gender because, dictionaries don't define words and words don't mean things. So we can just redefine everything that we want to redefine. But I don't live in that world, and I'm not going to let them get away with trying to force me to live in that world or make me conform to that world. So when I deal with socialism, I'm going to deal with the textbook definition of it and what true socialism is. Not like the author that said he wasn't concerned about the true meaning of socialism. But you see, this is the point, folks. Because quite honestly, the real reason that they're peddling all this nonsense about a non-definition of socialism is because it is manifestly evident that socialism has failed in every single place where it's ever been tried. That's why they're striving to change the narrative by trying to redefine it. And they're trying to redefine it, ironically, by stating that it has no definition. It's circular reasoning at its finest. Now listen to me. Let me say this. If you want to go off and live somewhere in a commune with a bunch of like-minded people, go right ahead. The Pilgrims tried that, and they found out it failed miserably. But you are free. You are free if you want to go and do that. If you believe Jesus taught socialism and you want to live in a Christian commune, go ahead. However, when talking about socialism as something that you want to institute or impose as a form of government upon everybody else, when we're talking about something that some people want the government to implement and to legislate upon society, then it must be precisely defined. And you know what? It has been. And there is a textbook dictionary definition of it, which I will definitely get to in a moment. But I'm going to say it again. When I talk about socialism over the course of these next several weeks, when I talk about socialism, when I talk about capitalism, I'm talking about what they are philosophically speaking, I'm talking about what they are philosophically speaking and by way of definition. And also, quite importantly, to my audience and to me, theologically speaking. The way government or a government may or may not be implementing them is not necessarily foremost in my mind, because let's deal with what they are first. The issue is a philosophical and theological one. And socialism, as a form of economic theory and philosophy of government, flat out violates the word of God. It's as simple as that, my friends. And we're going to get into that in a few moments. But if you want to find out how, then stick around. When I come back, we'll get into some defining moments. I'm going to take a break right now. Stick around. I'll be right back. Lord, strong and mighty, you are the King of glory, Chris Tomlin. Welcome back. Andy White here, and you are listening to Open Up the Doors here on Faith FM. If you're just tuning in, that's WEGB 90.7 and 93.3 in that peak, WEGQ 91.7 in Quag. And let me say this, the views expressed by the host of this show, namely me, are molded by the Word of God along with the empirical evidence, both experiential and observational, which is lived out by me on a daily basis, and the views that I express may not necessarily be the views of Faith FM or its associates or its pastoral staff, but they are my views, and I thank them for allowing me to express those views here on Faith FM, because we do believe in a lot of things that are common, like freedom of speech, for instance. But let me get on with what I'm talking about at hand. Does the Bible teach socialism? Was Jesus a socialist, as some today are trying to claim? And we need. I'm going to lay it out by defining socialism, by defining exactly what it is by the dictionary textbook definition. And this is the definition as it appears in the Merriam-Webster dictionary online. So you could just go look it up and see that I am not making it up. But according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, online dictionary, socialism, there are three declensions of the definition. And the first one is this: any of various economic and political theories, and here's the important point, advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. Second definition: a system of society or group living in which there is no private property. Underline that point, please. There is no private property. A system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. In other words, you've got no private property. You're not allowed to own your home. You're not allowed to own your farm. You're not allowed to own your business. A stage of society in Marxist theory transitional between capitalism and communism. In other words, full-fledged socialists, full-fledged communists understand that there's this transitional thing called socialism in between a full communist state. But it's distinguished by an unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done. Because this is the deal. Full socialist communism teaches egalitarianism. And Marxist theory recognizes that certain inequalities will exist in the transitional stage. So when these democratic socialists talk about, whoa, we're not socialists, we're democratic socialists, it's really a difference which means nothing. Because this is why Vladimir Lenin stated this famous quote: the goal of socialism is communism. Socialism is this transitional stage until full communistic theory and doctrine. And it needs to be clearly and emphatically stated, my friends, that every single one of those definitions that I just spoke of is antithetical to biblical precepts and principles, flat out of the gate. Now you might say, well, what do I mean? Well, we're going to look at, obviously I can't go through everything in the short amount of time that I have. But I want to look at a couple of the Ten Commandments, for instance, two of the commandments, because we're talking about foundations and principles, and the foundations of Western society and culture were built upon the Judeo-Christian ethic. And the core of that Judeo-Christian ethic, the core is the Ten Commandments. Now, for example, in refuting and emphasizing that the Bible is not socialist, we've got to go by the definitions and the implications of the principles. For example, in the Eighth Commandment says this: you shall not steal. Now, please note that the very commandment itself presupposes the legitimacy of a person's natural and God-given right to his own property, private property. It's my property. It's my money. And you cannot just take it from me without my permission, simply because you want it or even need it. It's called private property. If it wasn't private property and it wasn't mine, then stealing is a meaningless word. Now remember, a definition of socialism is there is no private property. So the very foundation of socialism breaks the eighth commandment implicitly. It's America's founding fathers, folks, often stated that natural law was based upon the laws of nature and of nature's God. And yet socialism seeks to strip society of its God-given and inalienable right to private property. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And by the way, I'll go down a bunny trail. The original draft meant property. I can't get into that right now. I can't. That's an interesting discussion in and of itself. But here's the bottom line. The right to private property. Karl Marx summed up the Communist Manifesto in one sentence. Abolition of private property. Remember, communism is a system of society or group living in which there is no private property. If there's no private property, then you're not stealing anything. It makes the point of stealing moot. Because thou shalt not steal, as I said again, I'm going to repeat, presupposes the right to your own property. Socialism is a system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state, both personally and in business. Under the textbook definition of socialism, you cannot own your own home or your farm or your business. Many of us live through the days of the United Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And during the Bolshevik Revolution, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian farmers lost their homes and farms. In 1920, the Bolsheviks seized control and collectivized the farms, which led to the Great Famine and the Ukrainian genocide of 1932 and 33, under the guise, mind you, of, quote, meeting the people's needs and redistributing the wealth. Well, under the guise of meeting the needs of people, under the guise of the redistribution of wealth, between 7 and 10 million people starved to death because of the government ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. And that is where socialism always ends up, my friends, with death and with misery and with depravity and with decadence. Just look at Venezuela. Venezuela today. We don't have to talk about the Soviet Union from several decades ago. We don't have to talk about Cuba. Well, actually, we will in a moment. Cuba's still communist. But look at Venezuela right now. Venezuela went from being one of the richest nations in the world because of its oil production when they were privately owned businesses. They went from being the richest, one of the richest nations in the world, to the devastation that we can all see after the government nationalized the oil companies and then nationalized the banks according to the tenets of socialism, according to the textbook definition of government ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. And this is what socialism looks like, my friends. All you got to do is look at the news and look at the magazine paper and the newspapers and look at what's going on in Venezuela, because that is where it ends, my friends. As Margaret Thatcher once famously said, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. Well, socialism has many other problems as well. It's not only about money. It's not only about economics. I believe socialism doesn't only bankrupt the nation. Socialism doesn't only bankrupt the economy. Sadly, and more profoundly, socialism will bankrupt the human soul. Socialism collapsed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Socialism collapsed Venezuela. It has left Cuba in abject poverty for decades now. Somebody on Facebook just commented, socialism is slavery under a different name. That is exactly right. Thanks, Brother Ron, for that comment. Socialism is slavery under a different name. Socialism violates, I'll say it again, it violates the laws of nature and of nature's God. The very first commandment to mankind was to be fruitful and multiply. And that commandment meant more than just the procreative aspect. God created man to be productive. He created man to enjoy the fruits of his labor. The writer of Ecclesiastes said this, "Here is what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor, in which he toils under the sun, all the days of his life which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth," notice that, God has given riches and wealth, and given him the power to eat of it, to receive his heritage, and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. That's the word of God. That's what the writer of Ecclesiastes says. But this passage is utterly antithetical to socialism. Riches and wealth are anathema in the socialist stream of consciousness, my friends. In the socialist state, you exist for and you produce for the state, not for yourself. You exist as a cog in the machinery of the collective. But the Bible says that your work and your production is your heritage, not the state's. But the socialist believes your heritage belongs to the state. Hey, did you ever hear of the death tax? Did you ever hear of what they euphemistically call the inheritance or the estate tax? It's utterly immoral. It's utterly immoral. It's nothing but unmitigated theft. Thou shalt not steal. But it's legitimized under the auspices of government. But folks, stealing is stealing, whether done by an individual crook or a crooked government. I've known people personally who have lost their farms and lost their homes because they couldn't pay the estate tax, the death tax. So they had to sell off their inheritance to pay the government the money that their family left them, the farm that their family left them. If that's not immoral, I don't know what is. The Bible calls it enjoying the fruit of one's labor. The Bible calls it receiving your heritage. The socialist says, no, give it to the state for the good of everybody else. But it's not for the good of everybody else. Confiscatory taxation, my friends, is stealing. Do I have time for one more example? You know what? I got to take a break. I got example after example after example, and I want to lay down the biblical principles, but I don't want to rush either. So I'm gonna take a break right now, and I'll be back in a few minutes, and I'll pick up where I left off. Stick around, folks. There's more to come. The fusion of heart, mind, and soul. This is Open Up the Doors with Andy White here on Faith FM, WEGB 90.7 and 93.3 in that peak, WEGQ 91.7 in Quad. Thanks for joining in, everybody, all across the fruited plain to this week's edition of Open Up the Doors. If you're just joining us, we are really kind of 2/3 of the way through. But I have been talking about socialism today. I'm going to be talking about socialism for the next couple of broadcasts, actually, and how socialism is not biblical, my friends. No matter how many ways the progressive left and the progressive Christians will try it and convince you that the Bible or Jesus was socialist, they were not. And we're covering this topic, and I'm going to be covering it pretty much in depth for the next couple of weeks because I believe it's important information. I believe we need an education, and we've got to push back against the rhetoric. We've got to push back against the propaganda. What they can't win over with the secularists, they're going to try and win over with the liberal Christians, and we need to understand biblical principles. And that's why I was talking about the eighth commandment in that last block. And I want to continue along that line of thinking. I want to look at the 10th commandment as we move along in defining what socialism is. The 10th commandment says this: you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Let me just condense this. The 10th commandment: you shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. Again, just like the 8th commandment, it needs to be clearly understood that this commandment presupposes a couple of things. Number one, that a person has a sacred right to their own things, their own personal and private property. And here's another one that's implicit in this. And a lot of people might miss this. But what's implicit in the 10th commandment is this: your neighbor may have things that you don't have. Your neighbor may be more prosperous than you are. Yeah. The Bible isn't egalitarian. Socialism is. In other words, life isn't necessarily fair. And egalitarianism, I'll say it again, is a socialist tenet, but it's not a biblical one. And socialism's main engine is envy. Stokes resentment against others who have more. It propagates its message by way of class warfare and the propaganda of quote-unquote fairness. And socialists capitalize. There's an oxymoron if I ever heard one. Socialists capitalize on discontent. There is a distinction, my friends. There is a distinction. Because they really, I'll say it again, they really capitalized, I'll use that word again, because I know it probably makes their heads explode, on discontent. They thrive on a victimhood and entitlement mentality based upon that egregious philosophy of egalitarianism, in terms like social justice, and terms like the equal distribution of wealth are really nothing other than euphemisms for entitlement, envy, and covetousness. But the Bible says thou shalt not covet. And there is a distinction that is essential and crucial to understanding. There is a fundamental point that I want to lay out here, and it's something I'm going to keep bringing up time and time again. Because both in the Bible as a whole and Jesus' teaching in particular, charity and altruism is an individualistic and personal virtue of sharing and benevolence voluntarily exercised. If you want to talk about giving to the poor, Jesus commanded us to give to the poor. The Bible makes provision for the poor. But in every place, the Bible never once, not in the law of Moses or in Jesus' teachings, ever mandated it as a governmental confiscatory policy of wealth redistribution. Never once. And it is precisely this fundamental point that progressive Christian socialists fail to acknowledge. They fail to grasp this idea that the fundamental difference between a voluntary contribution or a governmental confiscation, but that is the difference between night and day. And again, it's something I'm going to hammer home over the course of these broadcasts for the next few weeks. Because socialism, it masquerades as fairness and compassion. But it has nothing to do with fairness and compassion. It exploits the underclass. It exploits the working class. Not because they're really concerned about fairness and compassion, but it's about confiscation and control based on covetousness. You can look through their readings and writings till the cows come home, and that is always the underlying theme. I mentioned a moment ago this article I read the other night called Jesus is a Socialist, and I'm going to get into that article probably in the next week or two because it was absurd. But as I was reading this guy, you could see his spirit. You could see his heart coming out. Because every time he talked about the rich, he impugned them. Every time he talked about the rich, you could see his disdain for them. And of course, he would go to the scriptures where Jesus talked about how hard it was for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But the guy completely misses the point, which I'll get to in a week or two. But it's really, it's founded in covetousness. You could see it. And another thing I said a moment ago, it's an ideology that believes you exist for the sake of the state rather than the state existing for the sake of the people. It is a subtle but important distinction, my friends. We need to dismantle once and for all this idea about there being different forms and different styles of socialism. It's one of the arguments I've had with some of my socialist friends all the time. Oh, you can't talk about a hardcore Marxism. You can't talk about the Soviet Union. You know, they'll tell you that it was socialist that wasn't practiced right. We're for democratic socialism. It's nonsense. It's bunk. You could put the word democratic in front of the word socialism. It doesn't mitigate the cancer. Okay? It's a cancer. There are different forms and there are different variations of cancer as well, but it's still cancer. The Democratic Socialists of America flat out call them socialists on their webpage, and they say they are proud of their heritage. You don't believe me? Go to the Democratic Socialists of America webpage. I did. I read it last night. I read down through all their tenets. And you know what? As much as they want to use the word democratic in front of the word socialism, when you look at some of the people they reference, and when you look at some of the things they're talking about, it's straight up Marxism. Just because you put a word in front of the word socialism to make it more palatable doesn't make it anything less than what it really is. It's subterfuge. It's obfuscation. But they say this on their page. I quote it from their own website. Quote, "We also call ourselves socialists because we are proud of the traditions upon which we are based." Really? We are proud of the heritage of the Socialist Party. Really? You're proud of what the Bolsheviks did under the guise of redistributing the wealth. You're proud of that? You're proud of the 7 to 10 million people that died from starvation because the government took over the control and means of production? Because they say virtually the same thing on their page. When you go to the Democratic Socialist America website and read what they're advocating, it isn't at all very much different than the rhetoric and the verbiage that was used in the Communist Manifesto or the rhetoric that was used by the Bolsheviks. Now, if on the one hand you want to claim, as progressive Christians do, that socialism is biblical, when in reality it violates biblical law, as I've been pointing out, as well as biblical precepts and principles, and in violating biblical law, it also necessarily violates natural law, then you're a liar, or you're deceived, or you're confused. Because the Word of God never violates natural law, my friends, and socialism violates the laws of nature and of nature's God. And I've said numerous times, on numerous occasions, there's a reason the Founding Fathers used the phrase, the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. And socialism is completely and utterly incompatible, not only with biblical precept and principle, but as well as our Constitution of the United States. I got news for you. They could never be able to constitutionally institute even quote-unquote democratic socialism. Now, they certainly can, and they are trying to create an exorbitant, overburdened welfare state. And that is another issue. But true socialism, and I'm talking about the textbook definition, because there are certain things that are self-evident. There are certain things that are called first truths of reason, a priori reasoning. These a priori truths don't need to be proven They have no need of evidence because they are inherently and intrinsically and intuitively and instinctively universally known. But Marxism denies those things. It holds to the belief that wealth and property should be evenly distributed throughout society. Never has been, never will be. Not even under the laws of nature. Egalitarianism is not according to the laws of nature. Marxism holds that the government ought to be the arbiter of that distribution of wealth. The Democratic Socialists of America, they say they're not Marxist, yet they believe in exactly what Marxism teaches. From the webpage, quote, "The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the United States. We believe that working people should run both the economy and society democratically," they throw that word in there, "to meet human needs, not to make profits for a few." It's communism. Pure and simple. I'm running out of time. I've got a few minutes left here. I said it a moment ago. It's important to understand that socialism is a stepping stone to full-fledged Marxism. And they talk about upper stages and lower stages of Marxism. I'm going to skip that this week because there's a lot here, and I've only got a few minutes left. So I need to begin to wrap this up, but I'm going to pick it up again next week. But the bottom line is this. History has abundantly proven and shown that socialist theory has never worked and has failed miserably everywhere it's ever been tried. But again, the real agenda is ultimately about power. It's about world dominance, ultimately. It's about control, which is satanic at its very core. Now, I'm not saying that all socialists are satanic, but the very core of Marxist philosophy is God rejecting. It makes the state God. It's a humanistic approach to world governance. Socialistic imperialism will be the form of the kingdom of the beast. It will be the form of government of the kingdom of the beast. And sad to say, this is what is taking place right now at this very moment, that it's pushing towards this, even this soft socialism, this democratic socialist movement, this transitional phase toward a more completely socialist order, which, by the way, Islam is, by the way, for those who may be wondering. I'm going to cover next week some of the misconceptions about the early church practicing socialism. A lot of these progressive Christians, sincere Christians, some of them, will point to Acts 6 as a form of socialism. That's a canard, and I'm going to cover that in next week's broadcast. So many points. That I'm going to be dealing with this topic from a biblical perspective and worldview. But make no mistake about it. As Winston Churchill once famously stated, socialism is a philosophy of failure. It's the creed of ignorance. It's the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. It's not Christian. It's not biblical. And I will dismantle it and disassemble it on this broadcast over the course of the next several weeks. Thanks for tuning in, folks, to another edition of Open Up the Doors. I am out of time. God bless, folks. For those of you on Facebook, I'm signing out. Please share this around to your streams and tune in again next week. Same bat time, same bat channel to Open Up the Doors.